Reconstruction is really important because, again, in many respects, it's a return to, I say a return, it really gives us the first steps in civil rights in American history. Maybe we could say the abolitionist movement was a part of that. Maybe we could say the women's movement is a component part of that development. But as far as the U.S. Constitution and its development are concerned, the 13th Amendment, which is passed before the war comes to an end, in 1865 freed all American slaves, all people who were in bondage. 4.5 million Americans received their freedom. The 14th Amendment in 1868 gave African American citizenship rights for the first time. The 15th Amendment in 1870 gave African American males over the age of 21 the right to vote. For us, Reconstruction also features something else. It features the first time that the federal government tried to create an organization, a series of agencies to provide for the welfare of a group of American people. And these, of course, are the freedmen, the former slaves. This organization that I'm referring to is the Freedmen's Bureau. Sort of, for us, the first progressive agency to some extent. The Freedmen's Bureau was designed to work with former slave owners, to broker between former slave owners and slaves for opportunities to work as tenant farmers or sharecroppers. It was to open up schools that were to integrate a new generation of Southern children, black and white, and to give even adult freed men and women an education for the first time by establishing a public school system. It was to establish hospitals across the South. It was to provide job opportunities and to broker for fair job opportunities, fair labor opportunities for African American freedmen and women. In other words, the Freedmen's Bureau was a broad, encompassing federal agency with sweeping power. And how well did that work? Well, it worked well depending upon two factors, right? Number one, the ability of the people on the ground to work within the Southern communities dictated how well the Freedmen's Bureau would be successful on the ground on the one hand. But on the other hand, it was also tied to the federal funding that it would receive to be able to do the jobs or undertake the tasks that it had been assigned to do. So the Freedmen's Bureau is sort of a mixed success. In some ways it is a successful agency, and in other ways not so successful at all. Does it establish a public school system? The answer to that is yes. Does it set up hospitals for indigent and African American men, women, and children or families? Yes. Does it provide for civil rights protections in terms of dealing with former slave owners? In some cases, yes, but not in all. But what's the greatest factor in Reconstruction? There are two. Reconstruction ultimately does have some successes. African Americans are able to participate in the political process for the first time. One even becomes the governor of Louisiana for a few weeks or a very short period of time. We have the first U.S. senators as African Americans representing southern states who become elected in 1868 and 1870. The first African American congressmen are elected during Reconstruction. But ultimately, we have a couple of other factors that are at work. First, Reconstruction had been in the hands of the presidents. And that was because the executive branch saw Reconstruction as a military occupation, right? Because there was this view that Reconstruction was an extension of the Civil War itself. In other words, you were dealing with occupied territory. After the assassination of Lincoln on April 14th, 1965, and his death the next morning on April 15th, Reconstruction passed into the hands of possibly the worst American president in the history of the country, at least up to this time, and that is Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was picked by Lincoln because there was this hope that he could help as a senator from the state of Tennessee, a southern state, that he could bridge some of the divides between Northerners and Southerners and help heal the country as the war was coming to an end. But Andrew Johnson doesn't have the sensibility of the office of the presidency, and he's certainly no Lincoln. And Andrew Johnson Lincoln wanted to be lenient with the South, and he wanted Reconstruction, from a political sense, to be a quick process. Lincoln's under no illusions that the racism of the South is going to be the most important barrier or impediment to the process of Reconstruction. In fact, Lincoln says that it may take more than a century, in essence, to even begin the process of dealing with the racial divisions on the ground that are a component part of Reconstruction. But Johnson takes Reconstruction a step further. As Southern states ratify the 13th Amendment, as they rewrite their state constitutions, as they repudiate their debts, as they swear that they are going to repudiate the ideal of secession, Southern states are admitted quite easily back into the Union as Reconstruction is under the control of Andrew Johnson. In 1866, Republicans, radical Republicans who want tremendous and sweeping civil rights changes, and who want to punish the South, who want to give African Americans additional opportunities to get on their feet for the first time, so to speak. Joseph, thank you and take care. We'll see you tomorrow. Radical Republicans favor initiatives, right, to really level the playing field for African Americans as a part of the process of Reconstruction. When Johnson pardons ex-Confederate officials, when Johnson looks to be lenient on the Southern states, most of the Southern states take advantage of President Johnson's policies and establish, you guys probably remember reading these, the Black Codes for the first time. So in other words, even though the slaves are freed, in most Southern states by 1866 and 1867, if you were an African American, many of the restrictions that you had endured as a slave were now coming back as state law. The 14th Amendment, in essence, was the step that begins the process of dealing with the issue of the Black Codes by giving African American citizenship rights for the first time. The other thing that we have to kind of consider during this period of Reconstruction is that Congress and President Johnson do not see eye to eye on a number of issues. First, the military occupation of the South. Congress wants the South to have a military occupation because they want the civil rights issues to be taken care of and the Freedmen's Bureau to have an opportunity to be a working agency on the ground in the South. Johnson, not wanting to relitigate the Civil War again, vetoes this. Congress overrides the veto. Congress passes the Tenure of Office Act because Congress wants to have control of Reconstruction by having people who are favorable to Republican interests, such as the Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, in charge of Reconstruction, as he would be. Johnson, fearing the growing power of Congress, also vetoes the Tenure of Office Act, but Congress overrides the veto. Congress passes the 14th Amendment. Johnson vetoes this idea of giving African Americans full citizenship rights. Congress overrides the veto. Johnson tries to remove the Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, and place a Johnson loyalist in charge of the military occupation of the South. This leads to, hopefully you guys are writing this down, you're thinking about this, hopefully you remember this, right? This leads to the first impeachment of an American president, right? Johnson is impeached in the House of Representatives. Now he's put on trial in the U.S. Senate. Why? Essentially for denying the political will of Congress. Johnson had gone around the country on a whistle-stop tour in 1866 and 1867 promoting his point of view. But Congress sees this as Johnson defying their authority and their ability to control the reins of power in the process of Reconstruction. Johnson is acquitted by one vote. Why? Because Lyman Trumbull, a senator who had been a close cohort of Abraham Lincoln's, votes against the idea of impeaching and removing from office Andrew Johnson. Why? Because Trumbull said, this is really a political argument. It's a difference of ideas. President Johnson has not committed a high crime or misdemeanor. He simply opposes our policies over the issue and process of Reconstruction, right? This doesn't mean, in other words, this doesn't measure up to a crime, right, for which you could remove a president of the United States from office. So Johnson is acquitted, but he's permanently damaged politically. So in effect, too, are the radical Republicans in Congress, though now they have the reins of power. How does Reconstruction come to an end? Because it's going to last for another 8 years beyond 1868. Well, there's a couple of different factors that are at work. Number one, in 1868, we get a new U.S. president, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant's administration, by 1872, by the time he's reelected again, is immersed in what we will refer to as the credit mobilier scandal. There's tremendous corruption in the Grant administration. This scandal primarily has to do with receiving kickbacks from railroad companies, right, for the building of the transcontinental railroad system. The other issue, of course, is domestic terrorism, which arises in the South beginning in 1870 with the growth of the power of the Ku Klux Klan and other groups that are favorable to the Klan's interests on the ground in the South. From 1870 to 1874, the Klan literally makes war on the efforts of Reconstruction in the South. By 1875, Klan terrorism is so bad that most Northerners see that there is no solution for dealing with the violence in the South except to do the expensive thing of keeping federal troops in the South interminably. But that's where 1874 presents a problem. You see, because in 1873, due to the overbuilding of America's railroad system, the country faces another major financial panic. By 1875, 1876, Americans have no stomach for continuing the process of Reconstruction and the expense of it. Southerners see that they believe that scalawags, people who essentially are Southerners but favor the Republicans, and carpetbaggers, Northerners that have come in to become a part of the machinery of state politics in the South, right, have long been vested against their interests in the Reconstruction process. So there are charges of corruption in the state governments in the South, and largely those are mounted at those two groups and at the African Americans who are participating for the first time in state governments in the South. Add the Klan violence, add the charges of corruption, add the charges of corruption to the Grant administration, add the misery of having to pay for the federal occupation of troops in the South, add the problems of doing so with the rise of domestic terrorism, add a section of the country that is still slow to be willing to be rebuilt. By 1876, there is no stomach to continue the process of Reconstruction in the North. And with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, because of a compromise over the issue of Reconstruction, despite the fact that he loses the popular vote, Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the President of the United States in 1877, and federal troops are removed from the South. Reconstruction comes to an end, but something else begins. A Civil Rights Act of 1875 had been put on the books before Reconstruction came to an end by Republicans in Congress because of the fear that Southerners would try to destroy the rights that African Americans had established for themselves on the ground in Southern states. Principal among those rights were to have freedom of mobility, to have the freedom to have a public education. Beginning in the late 1870s, beginning in 1878, segregation begins to take hold, first in the public school systems that have been established in the southern states that are now in the hands of southern state governments. And eventually, through a series of Supreme Court rulings from 1883 and 1884, southern states also begin the process of segregating public transportation facilities throughout the South as well. So now all of a sudden, you have a system of segregation that comes out of the ashes of Reconstruction, right? And that brings us to a close for what race relations and civil rights will look like, culminating in the 1896 Supreme Court decision, which upholds segregation in public transportation facilities with the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in the state of Louisiana. This begins that 58-year process of segregation, Jim Crow segregation by law in the South that eventually will be erased by the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century. Okay?